Pecos Bill the Cowboy, a tall tale of American cowboys. Pecos Bill was a cowboy out in the wild, wild West. He lived when he was a baby with his mother, who was the old woman, and his father, who was the old man, and his 16 brothers and sisters in a little log cabin in Texas. The day after Bill was born, his mother wrapped him up cozy in a great big shaggy black bearskin, and she gave him his pappy's bowie knife and left him to play with himself while she went over to the fireplace to make the corn pone for breakfast. Bill was kicking and crowing when hi-yi, ki-yi, ow wow, a band of 50 Indians in the best make of feather headdresses, burst right in at the door. They all made a grab for the baby, but the old woman wouldn't have that. She just grabbed up her broomstick and hit out right and left. She lit into all those Indians. She banged them over the head and made her broomstick fly till she laid 'em all out cold. Then she swept 'em out the door and tidied up the room again. Well, after that, the Indians let baby Bill alone. The old woman gave the baby a grizzly bear cub to play with. Then she went out to the barnyard and got herself hitched up with her oldest boy to the plow. You see, the old man was planning to plow up a field for corn, but he didn't have any horses, and he didn't have any oxen. So he hitched up his old woman with Towhead, the oldest boy, and he walked behind the plow, holding the reins in his hand. Well, Towhead and the old woman were walking up the furrow, as quiet and as gentle as any farmer could wish, when all of a sudden, zip! Up flew a piece of white paper, dancing and whirling and flipping. The old lady spied that paper. She gave a big jump, and she shied. She put her head down, and she snorted. She took the bit in her teeth and tore off over the fields. And Towhead went wild too. He galloped off with his mother, rearing and tearing and plunging. There was a runaway for you. The old man couldn't control them. He hollered, "Whoa there, whoa!" But they dragged him along by the reins till he stubbed his toe on a stump, fell down flat in his stomach, and lost the reins out of his hand. Not till they were all worn out did Towhead and the old woman quiet down again. Well, when all this was over, the old man picked up the paper that had scared his team so badly. It was a piece of newspaper, and that was a great surprise. Before this, he'd been thinking that he had the state of Texas almost to himself. But if he had found a newspaper, there must be people near. Sure enough, he found he had neighbors not 2 days' journey away. "We're moving west," he said to his family, "where a man can breathe free and easy without having other folks cramp him and squeeze him and hem him in." So he loaded up his wagon with all their household goods, but he thought he wouldn't try hitching Towhead and the old woman to such a load as this. Wild horses would be better. Out he went on the plains and caught a couple of raring, tearing, snorting Texas mustangs. He hitched them up to the wagon, then he stuffed the old woman and 10 of the younger children, counting baby Bill, into the wagon too. The old man and the oldest boys walked by the horses' heads, and they set out to go further westward. They went along without mishap till they came to the Pecos River. There the horses plunged into the water, splashing and spattering and dripping. They were going up the other bank when the end of the wagon gave way. That wagon was just so plumb full of household goods and of children bursting out this way and that it couldn't stand the strain forever. The end board got pushed out, and baby Bill, who was sitting on the very edge of the wagon, fell down kerplunk to the ground. The old man and the old woman never noticed that he was gone. They had so many children that they never stopped to count noses more than once in 4 weeks, and they didn't miss baby Bill till the next nose counting came, 3 weeks from the following Tuesday, and then they had gone so far they couldn't turn back again. Well, baby Bill looked around and found himself all alone in a big world of sagebrush and cactus. He was lost in the Pecos country, and ever after that He was called Pecos Bill. Toddling along up the bank, he was getting mighty hungry when he met a nice-looking, motherly, hard-working mother coyote, one of those big prairie wolves that roam around in the West. Mrs. Coyote looked Bill over, and she took a liking to him, so she told him to jump on her back, and she carried him home to her burrow, the hole in the ground where she lived with her lively coyote pups. Pretty soon Bill was playing with those wild little coyote pups as if they were brothers and sisters. They were a mischievous lot, and plenty of pranks they played on the long-suffering Mrs. Coyote. Bill learned to talk their language, and he lived exactly as they did. Soon he was running with the pack, hunting deer and jackrabbits, and chasing over the plains, yipping and yapping and yelling. And he'd sit on a hill in the nighttime, howling to the big round moon, for all the world like a coyote. In fact, he was so very little when he went to live with the coyotes that he thought he was a coyote, and no doubt at all about it. He lived as one of the pack until he was 10 years old. But one day when he was 10, an old cowboy came loping along, riding at an easy pace through the Pecos River country on a nice little black pony. He saw Bill running around through the sagebrush and cactus, not wearing a stitch of clothing, as naked as when he was born. So he called to the little boy and said, "Who be you, little feller?" Bill peeked out from the sagebrush and he answered, "I'm a coyote." But the cowboy said, "Coyote nothing. You just can't be a coyote." "Don't I go naked?" asked Bill, coming up a little closer. "That's what the coyotes do, so you see I must be a coyote." "Injuns go naked," said the cowboy, "and Injuns are men. They're not coyotes." "Well, then I howl," cried Bill. "You see I must be a coyote." "But men howl too," said the cowboy. "Most particular men in Texas." "Anyhow, I'm a coyote." Bill started to run away. "Now, little feller, see here," the cowboy called him back. "If you were really a coyote, you would have a tail. All the coyotes have tails. Have you got a tail? I ask you." "I never thought of that," said Bill, and he looked around over his shoulder. Sure enough, it was true. He didn't have any tail. "Then I'm not a coyote," he said. "What in the world can I be?" "You're a man-child, that's what," said the cowboy. "And you'd better stop running with coyotes. You better come along with me and go back where men are men." So that's how Pecos Bill went back to the cow towns and cow camps of the cattle-raising country. He learned to ride any horse. Not the wildest wild bronco could throw him. He learned how to round up cattle and how to sling his rope to lasso whole herds at a time. One day he was sitting alone high up on a mountaintop when he looked down and saw a railroad train running along below. It was huffing and puffing and snorting, so Bill, having never in all his life seen a railroad train before, thought it was some strange critter. He slung his rope, and he roped it. He dragged it clean up in the air, almost to the mountaintop. But while it was dangling there, some friends of Bill's came along and told him what it was and that there were people in it. So Bill dropped the train down gently and set it back on its track. Bill could fight rattlesnakes, too. Once when he took off his boots and lay down to sleep for a little under a 40-foot cactus, 2 enormous rattlers crawled into his boots and hid. When he woke up again and went to put on his boots, those snakes began to rattle. They stuck out their fangs to strike, but Bill grabbed one in each hand, and he shook the daylights out of them. Then he tied their tails together and slung them over a tree, where he let them stay for a while, thinking about their sins, till they said they were sorry for their crimes and ready to be good snakes. Then he took them down and untied them. He put one around his neck in place of the bright red handkerchief most of the cowboys wear, and he used the other for a quirt to whip up his bucking bronco. There wasn't an ugly steer, a bad-acting horse, or an Indian who could get away with anything if Bill was on the job. He hunted great herds of buffalo, He wrestled with grizzly bears, and he fought all the horse thieves and robbers. He went after bad men so hard that he had them just scared to death. Bill was none of your two-gun men. Bill was a four-gun man. He could shoot 4 pistols at once, one with each of his hands and one with each of his feet, where he kept them hitched to his stirrups. All the robbers were afraid of him and soon took leave of the state. Texas was so cleaned up, there wasn't much left to do. So Bill began to think he'd better head further westward and clean up that country too. He made up his mind to be boss of the toughest outfit of hard-riding, straight-shooting, roaring cowboys that ever came scally-hooting into a dusty cowtown, and to wage a war to the finish with the bad men of the land. So he saddled up his horse and started out for New Mexico. Bill was singing when he met a trapper who said just the kind of tough outfit Bill wanted was camping up on the trail behind a rocky canyon. Bill was hurrying on toward the camp when his horse stubbed his toe and fell. He fell down and broke his neck. That was a blow, I'm telling you. Bill loved that horse like a pal. Often enough at night, when those two were all alone, riding the range or the trail, Bill had talked to his horse as if he'd been a human. But there wasn't a thing to do so far as the horse was concerned. He'd gone to the horse's heaven. So Bill made the best of matters. He took off the horse's saddle, slung it over his shoulder, and walked along up the trail. Pretty soon he heard a noise, and looking up all at once, he saw 2 big round eyes staring from the underbrush growing on a rock above. Quick as lightning, something sprang out, whizzing along through the air. It pounced right down on top of him. A big mountain lion it was, the terror of all the district. Bill set to wrestling at once, and he gave that mountain lion the licking of his young life. He threw him this way and that, till the lion was as tame as a cat. Then he put his saddle on the critter and rode him, whooping and yelling, down through the rocky canyon, swinging his rattlesnake quirt and making the big cat leap 100 feet at a jump. Soon he saw a chuck wagon with a bunch of cowboys nearby around their campfire eating. Splitting the air with his war whoops, his lions screeching and spitting, his rattlesnakes singing their rattles, he rode up to the fire, grabbed his lion by the ear, drew him back on his haunches, stepped off him, and looked at the outfit. The cowboys just sat, their mouths open, saying nothing at all. Spying a big pot of beans cooking over the fire, Bill reached in his hands, took out 2 sizzling handfuls, and swallowed them down, red hot. Then he seized a kettle of coffee and drank it down, still boiling. After that he said, "Who's the boss around here?" A big fellow, 8 feet tall, with 7 guns and 9 bowie knives bristling around in his belt, stood up and took off his hat. "Who's the boss around here?" He seemed kind of stunned as he spoke. "Stranger I was, but you be." The big man bowed his head, and all the other cowboys acknowledged Bill as their boss. So that's how Bill got the outfit that worked under him in New Mexico, rounding up millions of cattle, riding the big western ranges, and dealing out death to bad men. His good friends were Alakai Ike, Cheyenne Charlie, the Arizona Kid, Bullfrog Doyle, the dancer, and Pretty Pete Rogers, the best-dressed man at rodeos and dances. You should have seen Pretty Pete, with his silver-ornamented bridle, his silver-ornamented saddle, his grizzly bear chaps, big Stetson hat, high-heeled boots, and silver spurs. Pretty Pete was something to look at. He'd swing the girls at dances and have them as thick as flies crowding round him at barbecues. Leaping Lena and pitching Sal, handsome covered wagon Liz, and lovely rocking chair Emma had eyes for no other cowboy when Pretty Pete went to a hoedown. But the best pal Bill had in the world was a man named Curly Joe, a curly-headed fellow with legs bowed out like a wishbone from riding so much on horseback. How Bill did love Curly Joe. The two had sworn to be friends till that fierce old Indian chief Sitting Bull should stand up, and that, in the cowboy's language, meant forever and ever. But one day, a terrible thing happened to Curly Joe. Bill's pet horse was a bronco no one but Bill could ride. Widowmaker, he called that horse. He had thrown so many men. Riding that Widowmaker was just like riding a cyclone. Folks said he was fed on skyrockets. He'd shoot up so high in the air, if any strange man dared to mount him. His insides seemed full of bed springs. He was just as crazy as popcorn popping on a hot stove. With Bill he was so gentle that Bill could stake him to a hairpin, but he threw any other rider so high that birds could nest in their air before they fell down again. Well, Curly Joe had a hankering to ride that Widowmaker. He said he had never in all his life seen horseflesh he couldn't ride, and he'd bet he could stick on that bronco like a horsefly on a mule's ear. Bill begged him not to try it, but Joe kept teasing and teasing till at last Bill shook his head and said, "All right, you can try." So the cowboys all stood around while Bill tried to mount the horse, with Widowmaker looking sideways out of a wicked eye. But at the very moment that Joe got up at last on his back, Widowmaker put down his head and biff! He kicked the lid off. He threw Curly Joe so high that he shot up just like fireworks. He sailed along through the air, up and up and up, till he lit on the top of Pike's Peak. Bill saw it all through a spyglass. He saw Curly Joe come down on the very tip-top of Pike's Peak. He saw him sitting there on a rock as pointed as a needle, with cliffs falling down below him, steep and smooth as glass. He hadn't a chance to get down. And there was snow on the cliffs, big patches of shiny white snow, making the air as cold as a blizzard at the North Pole. Curly Joe sat there freezing, shivering, and shaking and starving. Well, Bill felt very sad. He watched Curly Joe through his spyglass, wondering what he could do, till he happened to think of his rope. He ran for that rope in a jiffy. He shook out the noose with a jerk. He whirled it about his head in big, enormous circles, faster and faster and faster. Then, zip, he let it go, with his eyes fastened straight on Pike's Peak. Sure enough, that rope slipped neatly over Joe's shoulders and caught him around the middle. Bill drew it in very carefully. He dragged Joe off Pike's Peak and down to camp again. But he never let any friend of his ride Widowmaker again. Bill rode the plains for years, rounding up his cattle, sleeping under the stars, dashing into the cowtowns, and ridding the land of bad men. But one day on the range he was driving his little dogies, as cowboys call their cattle, and singing at the top of his voice, "Whoopee-tee-ya-yo, get along, little doggies." All of a sudden he saw a little dude from the east with a great big pair of spectacles, limping up the road because he was sore from riding. He was leading a rat-tailed old plug with his ribs sticking out like bed slats. Bill could see at a glance that that dude couldn't ride a thing wilder than a wheelchair or a baby carriage, but his face was half hidden from sight under a big Stetson hat, and he was wearing chaps and a suit of cowboy's clothes bought from a mail-order store. When he heard Bill singing "Get Along, Little Doggies," he stopped politely and said, "I heard that song back east, but I wish you'd tell me, sir, where you keep your doggies. I haven't seen a single dog except for prairie dogs since I came out here to the west." Well, when Bill heard that, he laughed. The man thought doggies were doggies. Bill laughed, and he laughed, and he laughed. And he looked at that poor little lost dude in his cowboy clothes, and he laughed and he laughed again. He laughed and he laughed and he laughed, till he laughed himself to death. And that was a proper end for a man like Pecos Bill. In the rocks of Arizona, you can still see in places the footprints of Bill's big horses, and the great white spots in the desert that men call alkali lakes are really the baking powder left in the big mixing bowls his cooks dug out in the ground when they made baking powder biscuits to feed all that huge outfit of straight-shooting, hard-riding cowboys that followed Pecos Bill.